Tonight on Capitol Journal, budget hearings at the State House allow agencies to tell lawmakers just how badly inflation is cutting into their spending plans. We'll have the details. Alabama's unemployment rate hits a new record low. We'll review the numbers. With the primary elections coming up, we'll run down who is on the ballot. Candidates for Secretary of State Jim Zeigler and West Allen join us in studio to make their final pitch to voters. State Representative Chris Pringle offers an update on the state redistricting plan set to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. We are learning more about the church shooting in Vestavia Hills on Thursday. A third victim has now died, according to authorities. 84-year-old Walter Rainey of Irondale, 75-year-old Sarah Yeager of Pelham, and 84-year-old Jane Pounds of Hoover were shot and killed after a gunman opened fire with a handgun at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. Robert Finley Smith, a 70-year-old man who occasionally attended services at the church, has been charged now with 3 counts of capital murder. Police said the shooter was subdued on the scene by a church attendee they called a hero for saving lives. Agents with the FBI, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the ATF are joining local and state authorities in the investigation. Alabama's unemployment rate continues to decline and is at another all-time low. Governor Kay Ivey announced that the jobless rate for the month of May was 2.7%. That's down from the previous record of 2.8% in April, and down from 3.6% this time last year. The unemployment rate measures the number of Alabamians who are actively seeking work. In May, that number was 61,621 people, a new record low, and down almost 19,000 from a year ago. The number of people employed also reached a record high of 2.22 million in May. That's up about 600,000 from a year ago. And finally, the state's average weekly wage rose to a new record high of $1,004.65. This is all great news, but it's no secret that inflation continues to squeeze family budgets. This week, the Federal Reserve took steps to curb inflation and the higher prices it causes. But will it calm consumer fears that the economy is headed toward a recession? Capitol Journal's Randy Scott reports.
Many people are more than ready for a break with a change of scenery, but for some, it's hit a snag.
We're entering into the summer months, and historically, traditionally, obviously people want to go on vacation, they want to travel more, and so that always has an impact on gas prices. They tend to rise during summer months.
The reason for plans changing point to one thing: inflation, causing rising prices on everything from groceries to real estate and most notably gas. Dr. John Dove, a Troy University professor of economics, gives some insight into inflation.
Inflation is something that impacts every individual because we all buy goods and services. We all go to the grocery store. We all go to the gas station. And, inflation really affects, our purchasing power, your purchasing power, and my purchasing power, our ability to buy, things.
Dove says dealing with a global pandemic, a European conflict, and the strained demand for oil is causing worldwide ripples.
When you decrease oil production, that's something that can't just be changed overnight. We can't just increase and ramp up that production overnight. And so really what we're seeing is a pretty significant, mismatch between current demand for oil and then also the supply.
Dr. Dove says there is room for optimism.
We've seen these inflationary pressures build over the past couple of months, and it's really emerged as pretty significant inflation from these past couple of months, and it doesn't really appear as though there really will be any change to that in the immediate future. Again, it's going to come down to, at this point, really seeing what the Federal Reserve does as far as monetary policy especially is concerned. It's really kind of in their wheelhouse at this point.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
Inside the State House this week, The first of several informal budget hearings took place to allow lawmakers to determine what effect rising inflation and gas prices are having on state agencies. So far, in the 2022 fiscal year, state government expenditures have totaled about $29.16 billion. That's according to Kirk Fulford, the Deputy Director of the Legislative Services Agency. He told lawmakers that about 10% of those expenditures are items that are impacted by increased costs.
So why is inflation important to state agencies? Well, a state agency is not a heck of a lot different than you and I and some of the stuff that they have to buy. Have to buy gas. Department of Transportation, ALEA, spends lots of money on transportation expenses. They have to buy vehicles to drive. ALEA and DOT buys lots of vehicles. So as the cost of those items go up, it's no different than you and I have a finite amount of resources to spend. Then you have to make a decision about whether you can or cannot continue to buy or operate at the same level, because certain things that you have to do, you have to drive, are costing you more than other things that you don't necessarily have to do but you'd like to do. So it's an ongoing issue for everybody. It's not limited to individuals. It applies across the board. Your state agencies are going to feel the pressure if they haven't already, especially some of those that have capital projects in the works, because those projects are probably costing them more than what they anticipated when they set out to complete those projects.
Cam Ward, director of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, said his agency is mostly affected by increased gas prices. The Bureau has more than 500 vehicles, many of which are used to do status checks on the 44,000 people the agency monitors. He said increased costs will force the agency to take cars off the road, and that means less monitoring.
The biggest impact we're hit with, besides that PUF fund, and that is gas. And it's because we have 64 field offices, and our job is to monitor those 44,000 people out on probation or parole. They go out and they do home visits, they make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to be doing it. That costs gas. We went from last year to having an average of $66,000 a month to this year, we are now currently estimating at $125,000 a month. And even though we budget for inflationary purposes, none of us budgeted for this kind of increase, and it's going to bite pretty hard. We're going to be short on the budgeted amount in gas by about $483,940. That's our estimate. It's one of those things.
Alabama Medicaid Agency Commissioner Stephanie Azar also appeared before lawmakers. She said that a recession would impact Medicaid because when people lose jobs, they could become eligible for health care services, driving up costs not budgeted for. She said that in previous recessions, a 1% increase in unemployment has correlated to a 1.3% increase in Medicaid enrollment.
And I think everyone knows our nation is experiencing unprecedented inflation, as I think Kirk has just demonstrated. So it goes without saying that high inflation is definitely going to impact our program, just like it does anyone else. And like they stated a minute ago, you got gas and utilities, yes, but ours is a little bit different. Each budget year, you may know, I think all of you are familiar with the fact that Medicaid always adds in inflationary increases in our budget request. We do it every year. I can't probably count the number of times I've stood here and probably said to you that if Medicaid in a fictional world was sitting still and no other expenses were going up and nothing changed in Medicaid over a year, our program would still likely go up anywhere from $25 million to $35 million a year just in healthcare cost inflation alone. So it's always moving. That's one of the things I always explain, that even if we're staying flat, nothing else is happening, which it never happens, then it would still be on its way up. However, as you know, the pandemic has brought higher inflation that many did not anticipate, and quite honestly, we have no idea how it's going to go.
Lawmakers plan to continue the budget hearings in the coming weeks, when additional state agencies will have the opportunity to discuss their budgets. This week, the world recognized Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is meant to help the public understand the prevalence of the problem. We spoke to the Alabama Department of Human Resources Adult Protective Services Division about the nature of elder abuse and the common signs to look for.
Elder abuse is the intentional act or failure to act to protect a vulnerable person who might be subject to abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Common signs of elder abuse with the elderly person, they're often they're withdrawn or maybe a little depressed. You may see that they have unexplained bruises, scars, or marks. They may have soiled clothing. These are some things that you want to look for. If they're lethargic or unable to have a conversation with you, maybe they're isolated and not out in the open or available to speak with. It's reported that 1 in 10 elders in Alabama is a subject of abuse. In the state of Alabama, last year we had over 11,000 reports of abuse. And one interesting fact in that is that for every 4 incidents of abuse that occurs, it's likely that only one of those reports will be actually made to the state and investigated.
Now that the regular school year has ended, families are making summer plans. For many students, the State Department of Education would like for summer learning to be on the agenda. The department is once again partnering with some of the nation's top education organizations to promote summer learning to minimize academic loss. Capital Journal's Karen Goldsmith reports.
Even though the school year has ended, educators do not want summer learning loss or summer brain drain to begin.
Well, and the summer slide. We hear about the summer slide all the time too, and it is just where you've stopped your academic year in the spring and you're going on with other activities without really putting any focus into your academics. You come back to school in the fall and you've lost some of the things that you learned that previous year.
She recommends easy ways for parents and their kids to stay academically active.
Just being present with your child as they are reading gives them the opportunity to ask questions about vocabulary that might be confusing them, or giving them the opportunity where you're reading to them so that they can hear, y'all can discuss the things that are going on with the stories, or that y'all can interact in some math activities at home with cooking, and you're talking about measuring and getting out that quarter cup or that half cup, or just where you're counting out things that you might need for dinner or for activities that you're doing during the summer.
And it doesn't stop there. She has more.
Oh, it's great. This is the 10th year that the State Department of Education has done the Summer Learning Challenge, and we've roped up with some great partners who are helping support.
Parents of K-12 students can go to the State Department of Education's website, alabamaachieves.org, and click on the Communication tab. Then scroll down and click on the Summer Learning Program tab for links to partner resources. One of the partner resources is Alabama Public Television. Go to aptv.org and click on the Education tab. On that page are multiple learning tools. Also on that page, parents can scroll down to Summer of Possibilities and click on that link for additional fun summer learning options. For Capital Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
Well, the first phase of this election season is almost over. Alabama's Democratic and Republican primary runoff elections are coming up this Tuesday, June 21st. Let's take a look at what will be on the ballot. Of course, there's the big runoff in the Republican race for U.S. Senate, where Katie Britt is facing Mo Brooks. Britt won 45% of the vote to Brooks' 29% in the primary. The winner will face Democrat Will Boyd in November. We did have interviews with both Brooks and Britt earlier in the cycle, and you can find those videos online at aptv.org/Capital Journal. There is one statewide Democratic runoff, and that's in the race for governor. Malika Fortier, a state senator from Selma, faces Yolanda Flowers, a career educator from Birmingham. The two were closely matched in the primary, with Flowers winning almost 34% of the vote to Fortier's 32%. The winner will face incumbent Governor Kay Ivey in November. Ivey, of course, defeated 8 candidates to win her primary without a runoff. For Secretary of State on the Republican side, Wes Allen, a state representative from Troy, faces Jim Zeigler, the current state auditor who hails from Mobile. The two were closely matched in the primary, with Zeigler winning about 43% of the vote to Allen's 40%. The winner here will face Democrat Pamela Lafitte in November. I'll have interviews with both these candidates coming up later in the show. For state auditor, Andrew Sorrell, a state representative from Muscle Shoals, faces Stan Cook, a pastor from Birmingham. Sorrell had a slight advantage in the primary, winning 39% to Cook's 33%. There is no Democrat running for state auditor. For place 1 on the Public Service Commission, incumbent Jeremy Oden will face Brent Woodall in the runoff. Oden got 34% of the vote in the primary to Woodall's 31%. And for place 2 on the PSC, incumbent Chip Beaker will face Robert McCollum. Beaker got 43% in the primary to McCollum's 36%. There are no Democrats running for either seat on the Public Service Commission. And that's your primary ballot, or your runoff ballot. We certainly encourage you to vote on Tuesday. And we'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org.
Next, I'm joined by State Auditor Jim Zeigler, a candidate for Secretary of State. Mr. Zeigler, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
It's good to be back.
Well, as I said, you are a candidate right now for Secretary of State. That runoff election is on Tuesday. So I wanted to ask you, just generally, why are you running? Why do you want to be Secretary of State?
I first got concerned about the election process and the possibility of serious problems in the election in 2000, in the famous Bush-Gore presidential race, where they had the Florida challenge that went on 6 weeks or so. And after that, and because of the many problems, the National Republican Party decided to send a team of Republican lawyers, and they chose me along with about 50 others. And I went to Florida in 2004, 2008, and 2012 doing preventive medicine before the general election and running a hotline for workers and poll watchers and citizens calling in reports and questions on election day. And that was an eye-opener. It was like a master's degree in avoiding election problems.
Well, in this runoff, you're obviously facing Wes Allen in this Republican runoff. What sets you apart from your opponent?
First of all, regardless of which one of us wins Tuesday, I endorse the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. I'll be supporting him, and I hope that he and his people will be supporting me. But there is a big difference. He is backed by the Montgomery establishment with their hundreds of thousands in donations, their endorsements, their resources. I have been the guy that's questioned the establishment and challenged them and sometimes opposed them, and they are not for me in this race. Therefore, I got outspent 4-1 in the first primary, and it'll be something similar this time. So you got an establishment candidate and you got a people's candidate, and Jim Zeigler is the people's candidate.
You know, when it comes to elections and voting, it's really kind of a heated issue. It's only gotten hotter in recent years. And Democrats really paint Republicans as being kind of anti-voting, right? So, wanting to suppress the vote, wanting more restrictions on voting, less voting. And there have been lots of restrictions put on voting by Republicans. A ban on curbside voting, voter ID, things like this. So is that fair? Is it fair for Democrats to paint Republicans as when you do put in those restrictions like that?
I know it's not fair, and they're not restrictions on voting. They're restrictions on fraud, on voting fraud. That's a totally different thing. Alabama has the most open system for getting photo IDs to people of any state. The Secretary of State will not only goes to each county in the state, but will go to your house. If you can't get down to the place to get your free voter ID. Now, this is for people without a driver's license, and so they might not have a photo ID. Well, there's no excuse. In Alabama, it's free, and they'll come to you and get it to you. Also, we have the highest voter registration percentage that we've ever had. It's in the 90s, and one of the highest in the United States. So there's no voter suppression in Alabama. If somebody doesn't vote in Alabama, they didn't want to vote.
We'll take something like curbside voting, which we now have a ban on. What's the problem with that? Like, what's the problem with somebody dropping off a ballot in a curbside situation, kind of like mailing an envelope?
To me, it's comparable to the drive-through in McDonald's hamburgers. Except you drive through and you drop your ballot off. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything from ensuring that that person is the person whose ballot it is, that you get a good look at that person and the photo ID. It enables more fraud in that people could go from place to place quickly driving through. Our ballot boxes have served this country well for almost 250 years. I remember most of it. And I'm old school, the people of Alabama are old school. We're gonna keep the ballot box, not these curbside drop-offs.
Mm-hmm. So this election, 3 weeks ago, I guess, a little more than 3 weeks ago, during the primary election, it's a pretty disappointing turnout. I mean, it was already predicted to be low. It was lower than even predicted, and really kind of historically low. So, two questions. Why do you think that was, and what can be done to improve voter turnout going forward?
I have announced that I will push a program to encourage people to vote and inform them better about the election if I'm blessed to be the Secretary of State. I've named it the Don't Vote, Don't Complain plan. And basically, I would involve churches, civic organizations, media personalities, celebrities, athletes. See, I've got a model to go by. The current administration ran such a program for voter registration. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely successful. It worked, but now registration is not the problem in Alabama. It's voter turnout on election day. It was a 23% turnout in the May primary. That means of every 4 people you see, 3 of them did not vote at all. Think about that.
Well, yeah, and the anecdotal feedback on that I heard on that, again, this is not data, but it's anecdotes, where people were turned off by the ads. You had the governor's race that they were just attacking Kay Ivey, calling her every name in the book, but then also the Senate, the PACs and everything. I mean, you're talking 20, maybe even $30 million or more spent on these things. And it was just kind of a turnoff when you see them over and over again. Do you attribute part of the low turnout to that?
Yes, I think the negative ads, heavy negative ads, often from both sides, but not necessarily in the governor's race, it did discourage people from voting. I'm glad to say that I did not run any negative ads. My ads did not mention my opponent's name and have not in this runoff. I will say that on Thursday, which is the 16th, my opposition, not necessarily my opponent per se, but people who are against me, are starting a negative campaign. I don't think it'll work. I think it has the ability to backfire, to turn people off.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of ads and electioneering, we have seen instances in recent years, including this year, of groups, kind of shadow organizations that start up, don't report properly, then we'll go and change the law to try to get them to catch up. It's kind of frustrating because there are laws in place to have fair elections and make sure that people don't improperly influence elections, but it happens every year that they do. So what role can the Secretary of State play and if you win, can you play in actually enforcing those rules and stopping these shadow groups, kind of fly-by-night groups, from coming in and influencing the election, with no consequences?
I'm going to have our staff attorneys and some volunteer outside attorneys go through the existing election laws. They'll be looking at several things. One of them is what you just mentioned. What laws are there which these shadow groups, these outside groups, might not be meeting the letter and spirit of the law in identifying who it is that's paying for the ad and complying with the law. If we can come up with a way under the existing laws, the Secretary under the Zeigler administration will seek to do that. If there's no mechanism there, we would come with legislation. The Secretary has a legislative program every regular session, and we'll be no different.
Do you think increased penalties for some kind of activity like that would be on the table?
Well, absolutely. Some of the things now that aren't criminal need to be studied. Does this need to be a misdemeanor? Other things that are misdemeanors, do they need to be felonies? If they're felonies, do the terms of the sentence need to be increased? And I believe if a person is convicted of any kind of voter fraud or election fraud, they should be banned from the election process. They can't be a poll worker, a poll watcher, anything in the future. It only makes sense.
That's interesting because the incentive structure right now, there's the payoff is winning the election or defeating your opponent. So that's a great incentive versus there aren't a whole lot of disincentives to getting caught doing something. So that's interesting about penalties. Let me ask you this. Secretary of State, this is an important position. I understand that people consider it kind of down ballot compared to this really big election that we have, but this is a really important position. Administering elections, overseeing all the counties and the elections that they administer, really ensuring the integrity of the vote. And we've seen just how critical this can be. Just across the border in Georgia in the last election, I mean, you had a Secretary of State pressured by the president to essentially find the votes, and that must have been enormous pressure. And that sort of underscores the political nature of the job. You have to run for it, so you have to politic and get people to vote for you, and at the same time administer elections in a fair and nonpartisan way. So my question is, how can you do that? What's the balance? How can you assure voters, even though you're campaigning, that as Secretary of State you will have an even hand and not tip the scale?
I believe that the scale needs to be tipped, but tipped in favor of honest, accurate, fair elections, not tipped in favor of the Republicans, the Democrats, the new party, the Libertarian Party. Interestingly, we have a Democrat opponent in November. She has a solid resume, so this election will not be over this coming Tuesday,
Correct,
June 20th. Not only that, but a Libertarian candidate has qualified and will be on the ballot for Secretary of State. There is a rumor that the Democrats have a strategy. They believe the Libertarian candidate can take 10 to 15% from the Republican, making their Democrat candidate competitive.
I take your point, and I appreciate that. But again, I'm asking, it being by its very nature a political office, how can you assure citizens that as Secretary of State you can administer elections without thinking about politics and without tipping the scales?
Simply by doing it. Right now, there's more public distrust and questioning of the election process nationally than there's been in my lifetime, maybe ever. A high percentage, particularly of Republican voters, have a distrust. maybe not so much in Alabama. So the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Administer the elections well, fairly, accurately, and do preventive medicine. If you see a problem, a soft spot, fix it before voting day, not after. Right now we've got challenges and recounts and district line problems in several places, and those things will be better fixed beforehand.
Well, it'll be an interesting election night for sure. Mr. Zeigler, thank you for coming on Capitol Journal and sharing with our audience, a lot of voters, why you're running for office. Thanks again.
Thank you, Todd.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Next, I'm joined by State Representative Wes Allen from Troy, a candidate for Secretary of State. Representative Allen, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you for having me on today. I appreciate it, Todd.
Well, I just wanted to get started by asking you, why are you running for it? Why do you want to be Secretary of State of Alabama?
Well, as most of your viewers probably know, it's an open seat because Mr. Merrill is term limited, so it is an open seat. But elections are important. And with what we saw go on around the country in other states back in 2020 and what happened during that presidential election in some other states, elections are important, and the elections process is important. And that's where my experience comes in as a former probate judge and as a state legislator. And so we feel like this is a important office because we need somebody with experience and the passion and energy to make sure that we have great, safe, and secure elections, transparent elections moving forward.
You're, of course, in the Republican runoff in this primary, elections on Tuesday, against Jim Zeigler, the current state auditor. So let me ask you, what sets you apart from your opponent in this race?
Well, I'm the only candidate in this race that's ever been a chief elections official. I served for right at 10 years as a probate judge in Pike County, and I know what it's like to be at the courthouse at 5:30 on election day and to get the day going. I know what it's like to appoint and train poll workers. I know what it's like to work alongside your circuit clerk, the absentee election manager. I know what it's like to work alongside your sheriff, who is the caretaker and protects the chain of custody for our ballots. I know what it's like to work with our boards of registrars in our counties. And so with that experience, you know, I traveled to all the precincts in Pike County on election day and make sure those poll workers have what they need to execute and run elections on election day. And of course, I'm there from start to finish and lock the courthouse up when we're done counting votes on election night. So that's important, that we have somebody in office that can take a call from a probate judge that I have relationships with all over the state. And so if they ask a question of me, if I'm blessed enough to be the Secretary of State, it will not be a foreign question to me. I will understand what they're talking about, and there will not need to be any on-the-job training. And so on day one, I'll be ready to step in that office and to perform. And two, my state representative days here in the State House, we've done some tremendous work. I'm the only one in this race that has actually taken a vote to secure our elections and make our elections more secure. I sponsored and passed the bill to ban curbside voting. I sponsored and passed the bill to prohibit the Zuckerberg money from coming into the state of Alabama, because I believe that no private money should be used to purchase our machines, our ballots, or pay the salaries of our elections officials around the state. And so that's what sets me apart. It's experience and a passion, because I've been there and I've done it at the county level and at the state level.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you did. You sponsored the bill. Was that this session or last session?
Curbside was in 21.
21,
And then 22 was the Zuckerberg money.
Well, starting with curbside voting, let me ask you, what was the rationale behind that bill? Like, what's the problem with somebody, dropping their ballot off at a curbside, kind of like a post office box or something? Why is that a problem?
Well, we saw that issue in 2020 when a federal judge just came in and ordered Alabama to say, hey, you're going to offer curbside voting. And we were not set up to do that at all. We'd never done it before. And so luckily our AG, Steve Marshall, took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stayed that district court judge's order. And so we didn't have curbside voting in that 2020 election. But what we saw was we wanted to write that bill, put that bill into statute, and to make sure our elections are safe and secure. Because let's just imagine this studio is a precinct, if your ballot walks out the door to your car or to whoever car, when they pull up to vote, your private vote, your secret ballot is basically over. It's over. And also it loosens, and it loosens the chain of custody for our ballot. And so we just want to make sure that we have order on election day. And I believe in election day, not election month. And so we just want to make sure our elections are safe and secure and transparent.
And moving on to what you call the Zuckerberg thing, this is the bill that you had this last session that essentially for the public administration of elections, whether you're a county worker, state worker, whatever, you cannot be funded by, I guess, outside groups. And this has happened some in other states. Has it happened in Alabama where other groups sponsor it? I guess that's my question is, well, what's the problem with that? Outside groups coming in, are we underfunded? Could some of these things be helpful in terms of having funding?
No, I don't think we're underfunded. Matter of fact, our current Secretary of State said that whatever our counties needed, that we would get them, the state would get what they needed to execute on election day. And so we were not underfunded, but we had 7 counties in Alabama that took the private funding back in 2020. And we saw it go on around the country. Listen, it's just common sense. A core function of our government is to make sure our elections are safe and secure and transparent. And we don't need private money paying for our machines, like I said earlier, or the salaries of our elections officials. And there were some that wanted that accused us of saying that we were trying to prevent voter registration drives to be partnered up with some local elected officials, but we weren't saying that at all. They're just saying you can't compensate the elected official for any kind of service. They can still promote voter registration. They just can't get paid for it.
I see.
Yeah.
Democrats, speaking of these laws and others, Democrats tend to paint Republicans as, kind of anti-voting, wanting to suppress the vote or just lessen the vote somehow. And they point to laws like these and voter ID. Is that fair, or do they have a point in that these are sort of restrictions on voting?
They're not restrictions. We saw chaos and confusion around the country back in 2020 in other states. We didn't see that in Alabama because we have good policy in place to make sure we have order on election day. And that's what we want. We want order. And we want every vote, every legal vote that's cast to be counted. And that's the job of the Secretary of State, is to make sure he or she, as a Secretary of State, is interfacing with our probate judges, circuit clerks, sheriffs, and everyone involved in the elections process to make sure they have the resources and training that they need to make sure election day is smooth. And that's what we want. We don't want to deny anybody that's an American citizen that's registered to vote the right to vote. We want them to go out and exercise that right because it is precious. There are a lot of people around the world that wish they had that right to vote.
Well, speaking of voting, this last primary election, we had a pretty abysmal turnout. I mean, it was what Merrill predicted was going to be kind of low, and then it came in even lower than that. It was really disappointing. So my question, if you were the Secretary of State, what are some of the things you might do to maybe encourage higher voter turnout?
I certainly think that the Secretary of State can speak into that issue as far as turnout, but in my opinion, Todd, the role of a Secretary of State is to make sure we have safe, secure, and transparent elections, and to make sure all the legal votes that are cast are counted. The job of the candidates, in my opinion, is to drive turnout.
So it's not your job to make people vote. That's the candidate's job to get them out.
Right. It's their job to talk about enthusiasm and create enthusiasm to drive voters to the polls to vote for them. And so, as Secretary of State, I'll make sure our elections are safe, secure, and transparent, and work with those probate judges and those elections officials at the county level.
Well, that may kind of be the point, right? Because in this primary, we've had just this onslaught of negative, nasty ads, a lot on TV. You had the governor's race, you've had the Senate race, that just anecdotally, this isn't necessarily data, but anecdotally, I've been told by many people that I didn't want to vote. All that nastiness, it really was a turnoff for people to even go to the polls. Do you think that was a contributing factor to that low turnout, just all the negative ads?
It's hard for me to say whether or not that's a contributing factor, but I will say that your vote matters. I mean, I tell people that on the campaign trail. I've traveled this state, put thousands of miles on my vehicle since last May, traveling, campaigning. And I'm just trying to get across in our campaign that, hey, your vote matters. We've got a Senate race in East Alabama now that's come down to one vote. So,
That's right.
I mean, your vote matters, and that's what I want your viewers to know is your vote matters. And so talk to your neighbors, talk to your Sunday school class, talk to the people, your friends, and say, hey, don't forget about June the 21st because it is important. And people are very concerned about the direction of our country like I am. And so this is a way to have a voice. Go out on June the 21st in the primary and go vote.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about this. Almost every election for the past couple of cycles, or maybe even going back further, you've had these circumstances where, somebody will break the rules. A lot of times it's these outside groups that are kind of shadowy, fly-by-night groups. They'll come in, do some electioneering, do some influencing of the votes, but maybe they didn't disclose the right, paperwork or where the money's coming from. So it lacks transparency, and yet so many times they don't face. There's no consequences. They don't face punishment. What can you do as Secretary of State to crack down on that kind of bad actors, electioneering and campaigns?
Yeah, a couple of things. Number one is to have a good relationship with the AG and Steve Marshall, and to make sure that if we see that, if I'm Secretary of State, and we see that and find that, to turn that over to his office so they can prosecute it. And the second thing is because of my relationships in the State House with the representatives and the senators that I've built over the last 4 years serving District 89 in Pike and Dale counties, is to make sure we have stiffer penalties, is to lobby for bills, and help them pass bills that can be stiffer in penalties. So when it does happen, people will think twice before trying it again in Alabama.
Have there been any bills lately to contemplate that, even here in this last quadrennium?
Matter of fact, I sponsored a bill this past session, not only the Zuckerberg prohibition, the money prohibition, but also a bill that would prohibit ballot harvesting. And that is, there are some people out there that are getting paid and compensated for helping gather up absentee applications and absentee ballots. And listen, if you want to help somebody just because it's your immediate family or at the goodness of your heart, somebody that's homebound in your church, Sunday school class, and you want to help them vote absentee, that's fine. But this cottage industry that's going on about getting paid and compensated to going out and bringing in the absentee applications and absentee and going and gathering them up, we wanted to put a stop to that, but unfortunately we didn't get that across the finish line last session.
Is the thinking there that there's some bad incentives there? I mean, if you're paid to do it, well, some organization might be after certain votes, right? Those votes to go certain ways. Is it kind of that?
And undue pressure about, if they go out, they're getting compensated to go get paid for doing that. So there may be some pressure on some voters that the voters may not want to feel, you see. And so, but like, just say for instance, you've got a loved one that needs help and you're helping them, they're not going to feel pressure from you. I mean, because you're just helping them. But to get compensated for that and to go out and gather as many as possible, we don't want to put any undue pressure on the voter.
Well, that speaks to an issue I kind of wanted to get to. And you said it at the beginning of our interview that this is an important job. I realize we kind of, sometimes us in the media sometimes call it down ballot, but it's a very important job. I mean, overseeing the elections process, administering the elections, overseeing all the counties and their election processes, and yet it's a political job. So you have to get elected. You have to do and say the things that actually get people elected.
Sure.
But it comes with tremendous pressure, or it can't. We saw just across the border in Georgia last year, or I guess during 2020, President of the United States saying, hey, find me the votes. I can imagine the kind of pressure that must be on the Secretary of State. So my question is, given the balance between, okay, yes, it's a political office that requires you to get elected and politic and campaign, how can you assure voters and just the general public that the Secretary of State will administer elections fairly, without favor, and without tipping the scale to one party or the other?
Look at my record as a probate judge. Talk to my friends. Talk to the folks that I served with and served for down in Pike County as a probate judge. Ask them. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have been that probate judge in Pike County and developed so many friends and to serve alongside so many wonderful people. And so I just ask people to look at my record. That's how you just follow the law and you just treat people the way you want to be treated. And even though you may not agree on every issue, but you follow the law and you treat them the way you want to be treated. And that's what I intend to do as Secretary of State.
Well, look, only a few more days till the election. I know you're very busy, so we appreciate your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Next, I'm joined by State Representative Chris Pringle from Mobile. Mr. Pringle, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are the chairman, the co-chairman of the Legislative Redistricting Committee. Maybe that's not the proper title.
I'm the House chairman,
Okay.
and Senator McClendon is the Senate chairman.
And this is the Reapportionment Committee. Y'all did that work last year in special session. Of course, these lines that you drew have been challenged. And we finally, the congressional lines and the state House district lines and state Senate district lines. But the big news was the congressional districts that were challenged. It was pretty dramatic at the circuit court level. Supreme Court basically blocked that ruling, saying, no, these districts can go forward because it's too close to the election. But now we have a Supreme Court hearing scheduled for October 2nd to hear the case on these congressional district lines. Were they drawn correctly, that kind of thing. What can you tell us about the latest on this case and redistricting in general?
It's simple. We drew the lines, and they had filed a lawsuit before us before we even drafted a bill. So we had the lawsuit pending. They just amended their complaint after the bill was passed. And the three-judge federal panel ruled that we didn't rely enough on race in order to draw the districts, because we drew our districts race neutral. There was no racial breakdown when we actually drew them. We didn't look at race until after we had finished drawing the maps. And the three-judge panel said we should have relied more on race in order to draw two majority black districts. And they hired a demographer, and 2 million attempts with a computer, they never could draw two majority minority black districts. It doesn't happen. Even when you take away all the other parameters the courts have given us about compactness and contiguity and communities of interest, they basically said we have to rely solely on race, and we have to break communities up based on racial lines in order to achieve these two black districts, even though Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act clearly says that nothing in this act is to be misconstrued, that minorities shall be represented or elected in proportion to their population. Because in order to do that, you have to draw on nothing but race. So it's going to be an interesting fight. The Louisiana federal judge stayed a lawsuit saying that we have to decide the conflict between equal protection under the 14th Amendment and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. They're conflicting between your right to representation and drawing based solely on race under Section 2.
And I want to get back to that a little bit, but there's also these lawsuits dealing with the legislative lines, House and Senate. Where do those stand?
The courts have stayed those pending the outcome of the Supreme Court ruling, because it's the same charge that we illegally packed blacks into their district, diminishing the ability of them to influence other districts. It's called, you'll hear the term cracking and packing,
right.
And they're claiming we packed them in order to diminish it, but the conflict still goes into the 14th Amendment and the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, going back to the Supreme Court, and I was talking with the Attorney General about this months ago, really when this was a hot topic, but before they had a hearing scheduled. It seems to me that there are competing interests here, and you kind of got to it, that maybe the court, and only the Supreme Court, can address, because in one hand you're being asked to sort of draw districts fairly, blindly, making sure populations are represented, but then also, hey, we need you to create one majority minority district, or according to that circuit panel, two. So those seems to be kind of conflicting goals at the same time. Is that kind of an impossible task for a legislative body, and is this an opportunity for the Supreme Court to say for once and for all what you're actually supposed to do?
Yeah, exactly. Well, remember in 1947 the Supreme Court ruled that redistricting was a political thicket into which the courts should not wade, and declared it non-justicable. Then in '64, Reynolds v. Sims, which came out of Alabama because we had never reapportioned the state, is which kind of opened this whole reapportionment fight. And then the '64 Voting Rights Act just poured gasoline on the litigation side of it. Because when in the 1980s, when they were redistricting, they basically had to draw based solely on race. They would go through and draw and put, I think they were shooting for 65% black population in each legislative district, and whatever they had to do to get to that point. And then we've slowly backed off that, but the minority population in the state is represented in the legislature. Now the conflict is, how do you draw without relying solely on race? We're moving away from relying solely on race, but the courts ruled that we didn't rely enough.
And I can understand saying, okay, yeah, let's have 2 districts that there's at least an opportunity. Not majority minority, not majority black, because you said that's pretty much impossible. But what they were kind of proposing is you can get close to at least like opportunity districts. I can understand that being sort of a good goal or whatever. At the same time, if you're Democrats, don't you risk losing the one congressional district you've pretty much got a lock on, maybe even to make those 2 opportunity districts Republican?
Exactly. That's the threat. I mean, I don't understand, because some of the plans they've produced actually move Congresswoman Sewell out of her district and put her in Gary Palmer's district, and so that district and the new opportunity district are both open seats without an incumbent in them. And you do a racially polarized voting analysis in the state of Alabama, you could very well wind up with 7 Republican congressional districts in 2024 if we redraw what they're proposing.
Something tells me a lot of people would have a problem with that. I wanted to switch gears and talk about this state auditor situation. This is a race that's on the ballot. It's a state constitutional office, so it's going to be around for a while no matter what. But there was a lot of talk in the legislature this year, I know you were a part of some of it, about doing something with the state auditor office, because it is kind of seen as redundant compared to all that the examiners of public accounts do, and staff duplication, stuff like that. There's proposals to move it under examiners of public accounts. There's proposals to move it under the treasurer's office. There's a proposal to move examiners under the state auditor's office. What's your opinion on this, and what's the talk in the legislature?
There's been talk about doing away with the state auditor's office for 30 years. And it was kind of one of those forgotten offices and people say we might as well do away with it because the treasurer's office can handle the responsibility, because the auditor keeps up with property. The chairs we're sitting in, the desk we're sitting at, the cameras, that's state property, and that's what they keep up with, cars. The examiner of public accounts is a totally different subject. Under state law, the legislature appropriates all the funds. We are also, under state law, required to account for how those funds are spent. Remember, neither the governor or anybody else in state government has the power to spend 1 red cent of taxpayers' money that we don't appropriate. So we're responsible for appropriating it, we're responsible for accounting for it. And the examiner of public accounts is our general accounting office. They're the ones that go in and they audit every single county board of education, county commission, local offices, the probate judge, district judge, sheriff's office, district attorney's offices, and E911 boards, and every government agency and the executive branch. Our examiner audits all the executive branch officers.
Mm-hmm. And, considering the political ramifications, like I said, it's on the ballot this year. There's a runoff happening right now, and it's often referred to as kind of a political springboard because it's a statewide office. Look at the current auditors, Jim Zeigler, right? He's running for higher office for Secretary of State. So, there are a few political incentives for doing away with the office, especially for the person who holds that office or aspires to that office.
To do away with the examiner of public accounts office?
For the state auditor.
Yeah, I mean, that's been talked about in the legislature for years, and I defy anybody that can name the last 2 auditors before Jim Zeigler. I mean, you and I follow this stuff pretty close, and I can't think of who they were before Jim Zeigler got it.
I think Sam Shaw, but I mean...
I rest my case.
Yeah.
And Jim is usually office. I mean, he calls himself the chief agitator, and he's politicized it, and he's done a good job of getting his name out there. But the examiner of public accounts is not a political office. The examiner of public accounts is an employee of the Alabama legislature. The examiner is appointed by the legislature. There are certain qualifications the examiner has to have that elected officials don't have to have. This is a very complicated job. The examiner of public accounts is a lawyer that came out of the fiscal office, that understands accounting, that understands the law, that has to make a lot of legal decisions, has the power to put people under oath, has the power to, to prosecute people. If you lie to the examiner, it's a felony now. I rewrote the entire section of the code for the examiner's office, and we were very careful to make sure it was going to be a non-political office that was there to get a true accounting of where the taxpayers' money is being spent. And all those records, there are people being prosecuted right now. When the examiner finds somebody that has illegally spent taxpayers' money, they turn it over to the Attorney General for prosecution, or they go collect, they get the money paid back, or do both. And they release their reports every Friday at 9 a.m. Everything they do is public information. They just don't self-aggrandize it and get on TV and hold press conferences to make themselves look good. She does her job. She does her job well. She reports to the legislature. She holds everybody accountable to the same degree. And if there's a problem, blame the legislature for not acting. Don't blame the examiner.
You're, of course, speaking of Rachel Woodall, and we'll have to have her on the show. We're out of time, but thank you so much for coming on Capitol Journal.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be right back. That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next Friday night at 7:30 right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.